Sunday began like any other. A light morning fog slowly lifted, and the sun peeked through the windows of my old house on the outskirts of Savannah. I sat on the wooden porch, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in my hands. At my feet, my loyal pug, Charlie, snored softly, his little body curled up in a ball. At 9 years old, he wasn't just a pet. He was my confidant and companion, the keeper of all my quiet monologues. I sighed, watching the golden sunlight dance across the faded blue doors of my home. This place was my fortress, my world. Sometimes too small, sometimes too silent, but still mine. I'd grown used to this routine, this solitude. It was predictable, safe, even if it was a little lonely. The sudden rumble of an engine broke the peaceful silence. A dusty blue Chevy rounded the corner and came to a halt in my driveway. My nephew Jake hopped out, baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, a mischievous grin lighting up his face. Behind him, another figure emerged, taller, with an easy, confident stride and tousled light brown hair that caught the sun. His warm smile felt like a secret invitation to something unexpected. "Tante Marla," Jake called out, hands casually stuffed in his pockets. "Get ready. We're going for a drive. You need a break." Charlie perked up, his curly tail wagging furiously as he bounded over to greet them. I frowned, the words of refusal already forming on my lips. "Jake, I have so much to do." Jake squatted down to scratch behind Charlie's ears, completely ignoring my protest. "You can't be busy today," he teased, his eyes glinting. "It's Sunday. The world can survive without you for one afternoon." Before I could come up with another excuse, the tall young man stepped forward. His gaze met mine, steady and kind. He tilted his head slightly, and his smile softened into something that made the air feel warmer. "Come with us, Marla," he said gently. Charlie's already excited. "Why not join him?" Charlie barked in agreement, circling my feet with impatient energy. I couldn't help but smile. My stubborn little pug had already made up his mind. And somehow, the way the stranger looked at me made the idea of stepping away from my routine seem possible. "All right," I relented, a reluctant smile tugging at my lips. "Looks like I'm outvoted." I grabbed a light sweater, clipped the leash to Charlie's collar, and shut the blue door behind me. For the first time in a long while, the house felt too quiet, too still. The car smelled like old leather and vanilla air freshener. I settled into the back seat, Charlie snug on my lap, his eyes wide with excitement. Jake fiddled with the radio until an upbeat tune filled the space. Lucas, that was his name, I learned, guided the Chevy down winding roads, his hands steady on the wheel. The scenery blurred past us, rows of oak trees draped in Spanish moss, their branches swaying like dancers in the breeze. The air was fresh, tinged with the faint scent of salt from the distant ocean. My heart fluttered with a sensation I hadn't felt in years, anticipation. "We're heading to the old lighthouse," Jake announced, twisting around with a grin. "Remember it?" I nodded, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. Of course I remembered. The lighthouse had been my refuge once, a place where I felt limitless, where I could breathe without boundaries. But life had a way of piling responsibilities and expectations around you like bricks in a wall. The trips had stopped, and so it seemed had that sense of freedom. Lucas caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "You're going to love it," he said, his voice low and certain. I wanted to believe him. Maybe today I would. The lighthouse appeared in the distance, its white silhouette standing tall against the deepening blue sky. As we parked, the breeze carried the sound of crashing waves and the cries of gulls. Charlie leapt out first, his paws hitting the ground with determined enthusiasm. I stepped out slowly, drawing in a lungful of sea air. It felt like opening a window in a stuffy room. Lucas offered me his hand. "Need a hand?" I hesitated for a moment, then placed my hand in his. His grip was warm and steady, and something shifted inside me. A crack in the walls I'd built around myself. "Thank you," I whispered. We stood there for a moment, the wind tugging at our clothes, the ocean stretching endlessly before us. Charlie barked, urging us forward, as if he knew there was still more to discover. I smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to follow wherever the road might lead. The creak of old wooden planks beneath my feet was the first sound that greeted us as we stepped onto the boardwalk at the base of the lighthouse. Charlie, my little pug, took off exploring with the determination of a seasoned adventurer, his cully tail wagging like a metronome. Above us, Jake was already scrambling up the spiral staircase to the top, his excited voice echoing off the weathered walls. I lingered at the bottom, inhaling the salty air, my eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky kissed the endless blue of the ocean. "How are you holding up?" Lucas's voice was low and calm as he came up beside me. His amber eyes reflected the vast seascape, but they stayed focused on me. "It feels strange," I admitted with a small smile. "Like I've stepped back in time. Sometimes, stepping back can help us move forward," he said, his words carrying a quiet weight. I nodded, and we started walking along a narrow path that hugged the cliffs. The wind was brisk, but the sun's warmth settled comfortably on my shoulders. Charlie trotted ahead, paws thumping rhythmically on the damp sand. We wandered over to an old pier, its planks faded to silver and leaning slightly, worn by years of tides and storms. Seaweed clung to the pilings, and beneath us, the water whispered against the beams, an endless, soothing lullaby. I knelt down to pat Charlie, who had plopped himself down contentedly at my feet. "You used to come here a lot, didn't you?" Lucas's question was soft, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid of disturbing something fragile. "Yeah," I replied, my gaze fixed on the waves. "It used to be my escape, a place where I felt like anything was possible. But then life happened, and I guess I just stopped coming." Lucas crouched next to me, his shoulder brushing against mine. The quiet stretched between us, filled with the sound of the sea and the distant cries of gulls. Charlie yawned and curled up, as if settling in for a story he already knew by heart. "I think," Lucas said slowly, "we sometimes build walls around ourselves. Walls that don't really need to be there." I turned to look at him, the breeze tousling his hair. His eyes held a steady warmth, as if he saw something more in me than just a woman caught in the gears of routine. "Maybe you're right," I whispered. He smiled, a small, hopeful smile that tugged at something deep inside me. "So, what do you want to do about it?" he asked, his voice barely more than a murmur. Before I could answer, Charlie leapt up with a sudden burst of energy, barking at a flock of seagulls that exploded into the sky. I laughed, the tension breaking like a wave crashing against the rocks. Lucas chuckled, standing up and offering me his hand. "How about we check out the lighthouse? See the world from a different angle?" I took his hand, his fingers warm and strong around mine. "Sounds like a plan." The lighthouse steps were steep and worn smooth by time. I climbed carefully, Charlie scampering ahead like a tiny, fearless guide. My heart pounded, not just from the effort, but from something else, a mix of anxiety and exhilaration. The walls I'd built around myself felt fragile, ready to crack. When we finally reached the top, the view stole my breath. The ocean stretched out to infinity, waves glinting like scattered coins under the sun. The breeze was sharper up here, full of salt and freedom. I leaned against the railing, letting it wash over me. "Not bad, right?" Lucas asked, his voice light but his eyes serious. "It's beautiful," I said, but I wasn't just talking about the view. For the first time in years, I felt the weight on my shoulders lift. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe the only thing standing between me and freedom was the walls I'd built myself. I took a deep breath, the wind tangling my hair, the sun warm on my face. "Thank you for this," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded, his gaze on the endless horizon. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to step beyond my walls. We drove back down the empty road, bathed in the golden glow of a sun that seemed in no hurry to set. Sunbeams filtered through the gnarled branches of old oak trees, their Spanish moss swaying gently in the breeze. Charlie snoozed on my lap, his little body rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Jake, up front, tapped his fingers on the steering wheel to the beat of whatever song played on the radio, lost in his own world. Lucas sat next to me, his shoulder brushing mine ever so slightly. It was the smallest touch, but warmth spread through me like the first sip of hot coffee on a cool morning. Neither of us spoke, yet the quiet between us felt full, charged with thoughts and possibilities we hadn't yet voiced. "How about some coffee?" Jake asked, glancing at us through the rearview mirror. "I know a great little place up ahead." I realized how long it had been since I'd allowed myself something as simple as stopping for coffee. "That sounds perfect," I said. Jake pulled the car off the main road, and soon we parked in front of a small cafe nestled on the corner of an old intersection. A neon sign buzzed softly, glowing with the words, "Pine and Brew." The place looked like it belonged to another era, with its weathered brick facade and windows fogged up from the warmth inside. As we stepped in, the door chimed, and a wave of rich aromas washed over us: freshly ground coffee, warm pastries, and a hint of vanilla. Behind the counter, a woman in her 70s with silver hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun adjusted her glasses and gave us a welcoming smile. "Take a seat, folks," she called out. "I've got just what you need." We slid into a cozy booth by the window. Jake immediately buried himself in his phone, leaving Lucas and me in a bubble of quiet companionship. Charlie, back on his feet, sniffed around the table legs, his curly tail wagging in approval. "This place feels like it's been here forever," I said, taking in the vintage coffee tins on the shelves and the old black and white photos framed on the walls. The clock above the counter ticked loudly, as though it refused to join the modern world. "That's what I love about it," Lucas replied, his eyes reflecting the warm light. "Sometimes the best things are the ones that don't change." He glanced at me, and I felt the weight of his words settle in my chest. The waitress brought over 2 mugs, mine filled with a pumpkin spice latte, complete with a cloud of whipped cream and a dusting of cinnamon. Lucas's was black coffee, strong and simple. The heat from the mug seeped into my hands, grounding me. "Marla," Lucas said, his voice quiet but clear, "why did you stop going to the lighthouse?" I traced a finger through the condensation on my mug, the question stirring up memories I wasn't sure I wanted to face. "I guess life got complicated," I admitted. I convinced myself that dreams were for younger people, that it was safer to stay put. He nodded, as though he understood every unspoken word. "I think we build walls to protect ourselves," he said. "But sometimes those walls keep out more than just the bad stuff." I looked up at him, surprised by how easily his words chipped away at my defenses. "Maybe you're right," I whispered. Charlie suddenly perked up, his attention drawn to a little girl at the next table. She giggled as he spun in a circle, trying to catch his own tail. The sound of her laughter was pure and unguarded, and I couldn't help but smile. "See?" Lucas said, nodding toward Charlie. "He's not worried about the past or the future. He's just living in the moment." I watched my little dog, so carefree, and felt a wave of something light and new wash over me. Maybe I didn't have to keep hiding behind the walls I'd built. Maybe I could let a little light in. "Thanks for today," I said softly. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that warmed me more than the coffee. "You won't regret it," he promised. The sun dipped lower, casting a soft glow through the window. The cafe buzzed with quiet conversations, but the space between Lucas and me held its own kind of energy, a quiet promise of new beginnings. For the first time in a long while, I felt ready to see where the road might lead. We drove back down the narrow, winding road, the day slowly giving way to twilight. Long shadows stretched across the pavement, and the sun hung low on the horizon, spilling golden light through the trees. The air felt cooler now, tinged with that crispness that comes just before nightfall. Charlie snored softly on my lap, completely worn out from his adventures, while Jake hummed along to the music playing from his phone. Lucas sat beside me, quiet and thoughtful. His shoulder brushed against mine in the most subtle, reassuring way. We didn't speak, but words didn't seem necessary. The silence between us felt full of things we weren't ready to say out loud, but could both feel. As we turned onto my street, the familiar sight of my blue front door came into view, bathed in the soft orange glow of the setting sun. Jake pulled the car to a stop and stretched, his grin lazy and satisfied. "Thanks for coming, Aunt Marla," he said, hopping out of the car. "Today was awesome." "It really was," I replied, meaning every word. He flashed me a peace sign and wandered off toward his car, lost in his own world. Charlie yawned and jumped down from my lap, his little legs stretching as he took in the familiar scent of home. Lucas came around to my side, offering his hand as I got out. I took it, savoring the warmth of his fingers around mine. We stood together, watching the sun inch closer to the horizon. The world was painted in hues of gold and purple, a quiet beauty that made me ache with something I couldn't quite name. "Thank you," I said softly, turning to Lucas. "For today. For pushing me to come along." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling just a little. "I didn't push too hard, did I?" I shook my head. "No. Just enough." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, sometimes the best journeys start with a single step." I met his eyes, the truth of his words sinking in. For so long, I'd been standing still, afraid to take even that first step. But now it felt like maybe, just maybe, I was ready. "Do you think I'm ready for that step?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas's eyes softened. "I think you've been ready for a long time." Charlie chose that moment to trot over to Lucas, sniffing his shoes before giving a satisfied little snort, as if to say he's all right. We both laughed, the sound light and easy. "Looks like you have Charlie's approval," I teased. "That's all I need," he replied, his smile growing wider. We walked slowly up to my front porch. The blue door, once a symbol of my solitude, now seemed to hold a different kind of promise. Lucas paused at the bottom step, his eyes searching mine. "This feels like a beginning," he said. I nodded. "It does." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle and unhurried. The warmth of his fingers lingered on my cheek, a quiet reassurance that this was real. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "I'd like that," I said, a smile spreading across my face. He leaned in and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was a promise, a tender acknowledgement of the connection we were building. Charlie barked softly, as if reminding us that the night was still young, and we both laughed. "Good night, Marla," Lucas said, his voice low and warm. "Good night, Lucas," I replied, watching as he walked back to the car. As the engine rumbled to life and his taillights disappeared down the street, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle sense that something new was beginning, something worth embracing. I opened the door and stepped inside, Charlie padding after me. For once, the house didn't feel too quiet. It felt filled with possibilities. Sometimes, all it takes to start a new chapter is the courage to turn the page. And for the first time in a long while, I was ready to see what came next.